to hear what Safe Wings Ottawa has to share, and learning about the progress that they've made in Ottawa with bird safe collision monitoring. So feel free to take it away.
Great. A couple of things I will just say to start with is I am currently at a room at Carleton. I don't have a room full of dead birds at home. If you're wondering what's behind me. And also the lights tend to go out after about half an hour. So I may have to wave my arms suddenly if the lights go out. So just so you know, I'll be talking for about 35 minutes, and yeah, hopefully that'll leave lots of time for a discussion afterwards. So first, I'll tell you a little bit about me. I am a PhD student at Carleton. I work with Arctic breeding shorebirds, and my work has absolutely nothing to do with collisions. However, I have been volunteering with Safe Wings for about 5 years, and I'm now head of the advocacy subcommittee. So this is sort of something I do that's related to my PhD work in terms of both being bird related, but not specifically what I'm studying. So now let's move on to how Safe Wings started. And there was an incident where a flock of Bohemian waxwings collided with a glass walkway at City Hall in Ottawa. And you can see that at the top of the picture, at the top of the screen. And that's Anouk in the foreground there, who started Safe Wings when this big collision event happened. And there were several dozen dead birds, injured birds who managed to fly away and died elsewhere. And this really just made it clear that there was a problem with collisions in the city. And it was such a visually striking thing that it really got people started thinking. And Safe Wings started as a subcommittee of the Ottawa Field Naturalists and remains that. And maybe in the discussion, we can talk a little bit about the pros and cons of being part of another group. So what does Safe Wings do? You may be a bit surprised by this picture. We do have turkeys. This is a turkey in downtown Ottawa that died after it collided with the Bank of Canada after an off-leash dog startled it. So it really shows that any bird can collide. Well, the first thing that really started, Safe Wings really started to do with building monitoring. And we do this to identify problem buildings and to collect data on it so that we can present the building owners that there's proof of a problem, and also to get just more information about what kinds of birds are colliding in Ottawa, when they're colliding. And then of course we do sometimes find injured birds, which we're able to help sometimes. Now, monitoring is something that we found really varies a lot from place to place. We monitor in two main areas in Ottawa, downtown Ottawa, where we have buildings like the one at the top. And you wouldn't think that there's a lot of collisions there, but there's a lot of light pollution drawing in birds from along the river where they migrate. And so there's lots of collisions there. But they tend to happen in the very early morning, where at first light birds kind of realize that they're somewhere where they don't want to be, and they try and leave. So lots of collisions happening all at once early in the morning. It's not always like that, but more so than other locations. And then down at the bottom, there's one of the buildings in the Canada North Tech Park, which is a bunch of mirrored glass buildings built in what is essentially a marsh. And this is an area where we tend to find collisions more all day, because birds are not just passing by, they're also stopping over there or even breeding there. And so we tend to find birds there through the summer as well as just in migration. We also have individual bad buildings across the city, and those ones also have, their various differences in terms of things like when birds tend to hit and what birds and what scavenges birds from the area. There's also some differences in logistics in terms of downtown. You don't really need a car to monitor the buildings. They're all close together, whereas out in Canada, you do need a car to go between buildings because they're all far apart. In addition to the monitoring done by our volunteers, we also do get reports from the public, including at residential, like single family houses, which is good because we really just can't monitor those, both for, privacy, public or private property concerns, and because It's not worth the volunteers' time to do a lot of monitoring of small buildings. So monitoring is fairly simple in that you're just wandering around buildings or outside buildings looking for dead and injured birds, but there's actually a fair amount that goes into it, and that's why we do some pretty extensive training with our volunteers. One of the most important things we do is teach them how to document what they find, and that involves things like taking photos where they can show where the bird is, what kind of bird it is, where the bird actually struck, or like what area it was found. We also have training on how to identify a bird that needs to be rescued versus a bird that just happens to be nearby. You know, the one in the bottom left there is showing all the typical signs of collision. You know, it's got its eyes closed, kind of hunched down, puffed up. But there are lots of birds, especially in Canada, that just kind of live near these buildings. So we need to make sure that our volunteers aren't trying to rescue everything if it doesn't need rescuing. And then at the end of the year, we tend to do a lot of proofing, which can involve, you know, making sure that the species are correctly identified. Not all of our volunteers are birders. Some of them just like birds, but they're not able to identify a lot of the species. And then making sure that things like the numbers we have, you can see in the top picture, the little white tags, and those are super essential to organizing the birds, and these each have a unique number on them, and that matches the data. So making sure that all of those are correct. And then there's some challenges we've run into about deciding what data to collect. And there's a bit of a trade-off here between what's feasible for your volunteers in terms of the amount of time it takes them, as well as what you're actually trying to do with that data, because you're going to collect very different data if you're trying to do a published study versus if you're just trying to show that there's a problem. And for a published study, you need to have things like effort, how long you're spending out there. Whereas if you're just trying to show a building that there's a lot of birds colliding there, that doesn't really matter as much. It's also really important to think about things that can affect your data quality. For example, in this middle picture, it might be a bit hard to see, but this is what we sometimes find when there's a carcass that's been scavenged. So there's a whole bunch of feathers there. And normally, you know, when we pick up a bird and take it with us, or we move it if it's not salvageable, you know, that prevents other people from double counting. But when you have this, you know, 100 feathers on the ground, it's not feasible to pick them all up, but you also want to make sure that a volunteer the next day doesn't count them. We also have to organize our actual volunteers and make sure that we're not having, you know, 10 people out in one area in one day and then no one out in the rest of the city the rest of the week. So we've tested some organizational software last season. It didn't work that well. And we have other methods as well, and we're trying a new software this season. There's also things like access to private property. There's some buildings that don't really question that we're there. Other times we've been approached by security guards. And then there's buildings, especially in Ottawa, that, you know, we're not allowed to be at. And there's obviously things to prevent that. Like the one at the bottom is the Electronic Spy Agency for Canada, and they actually are treating this building, and they have some of their staff monitoring it, but we're not allowed to monitor it. And we also can't get data with any names on it because that would tell us who works there, which we're not allowed to know. One thing that may not be obvious until you have a really busy day is live bird storage. And if we're downtown, there's been a few days where we've had, you know, 50 live birds. It's not often, but it does happen. And having a place, a building where they let you put the birds in their closet for a couple of hours while you're monitoring is really important because cars can get pretty hot. So what have we found from all of this monitoring? Well, lots of birds are colliding in Ottawa. We had almost 5,000 birds documented in 2020, although we know that that's really only the tip of the iceberg. Our estimates suggest that there's more like 250,000 hitting each year in Ottawa. And just to look at the diversity here, we're seeing a lot of warblers and sparrows especially. Chickadees vary from year to year. In fall, when we have movements of juveniles, we get lots of chickadee hits, but in spring with resident birds, not nearly as many. Kinglets tend to hit as a group. We had one building that had about 60 birds hit over the course of an hour. So, you can often find large numbers of them at once. And then really, besides that, it's just important to look at the variety of birds. I found this green heron at the top at Canada North a couple of years ago, and I was very surprised. It was our first one, but they do collide. And then we also have a number of species at risk, individuals of species at risk. So that's important, especially important to document and recognize those. So Safe Wings, in addition to monitoring, we have a hotline, and this is a number that is passed from person to person. It's not always one person. It's basically an electronic number, and we have software that changes whose number it goes to. And we're able to give information about what to do with birds that have collided. That's sort of how it started. But we also now offer advice on other bird-related injuries or illnesses. And when possible, we do have volunteers who can help. In the top picture, there is a bird in that bin. There's a Canada goose we rescued with a broken wing. And we're able to get other volunteers, such as this arborist renesting a bird. But this does take a lot of volunteers and a lot of coordination. We have 2 volunteers who are permitted to have in-house rehabilitation, and unsurprisingly, we specialized in window collisions. One of the treatments we're able to offer is oxygen therapy, so a highly concentrated oxygen, and that seems to really help birds with concussions. We only do short-term care, and we don't do major injuries. And so when we have birds with those needs, they're transferred to other facilities. But this just shows, some of the diversity of birds that come through our rehabbers. Now, working with the birds ourselves has really allowed us to learn a lot about post-collisions injuries. And the main thing we've learned is that many injuries take time to appear. It was long the sort of belief that if you had a bird collide and it looks stunned, put it in a box for half an hour, and if it looks lively, then you can let it go. And we found that this is really not the case. For example, brown creepers seem to be very prone to having air sac punctures, where they'll slowly leak air under the skin with every breath, and they actually inflate like little balloons, and they need to be deflated regularly as they heal. And so this is something that's not obvious until about 24 to 48 hours. Similarly, a bird with a slow bleed in either the brain or the eye may be fine half an hour after, but will become either blind or disoriented later on when that becomes more of an issue. And so finding out more about what happens to birds after they survive the initial collision has allowed us to change both our protocols and has allowed us to help other centers change their protocols, as well as advising the public. And just there are exceptions. Kinglets and hummingbirds we find just do not do very well in captivity. So with those species, we tend to release them as soon as we can if they're lively and seem to be okay. And we don't know if that's the best thing to do, but they do tend to die a lot in captivity. And I think it's because they're very high stress birds. So let's move on to outreach. And this is something that I work with extensively, so I'll have a bit more focus here. We do a bunch of general outreach, such as with these yearly displays with all the birds that we've collected over the course of the season. Numbers, 250,000 is a lot, but it doesn't mean much to people. So being able to see all these birds and the diversity of birds that have struck really makes it obvious to people that there's a problem. During COVID, we did have an online version with FLAP, and we're looking at our options for this year. Additionally, we have volunteers who are able to go to local meetings or events like environmental days, environmental fairs, Earth Day, that sort of thing. We give talks like this one, and we tend to be the go-to for media interviews for a lot of bird-related things now, not just windows. So we've worked extensively with the local government in Ottawa. One of the first things that was done with Safe Wings and a number of other nonprofits is coming up with the Ottawa Bird Strategy, which basically outlined the challenges that birds face in Ottawa, not just window collisions, but other things like cats and cars and habitat loss. And this identified also the solutions. And one of the main recommendations from that was having these bird safe design guidelines, which is something that we help the city to develop. And these are basically methods that developers and architects can use to make sure that new buildings are bird safe. And unfortunately, because of Ottawa's city charter, these are not mandatory, but the city is pushing it pretty hard. Toronto's guidelines are mandatory. And this is really important because we see a lot of building applications that come in like the bottom right with a lot of glass, and especially a lot of these transparent balcony railings around things like balconies and rooftop gardens. We've also been working with OC Transpo, which is public transportation in Ottawa. They designed the LRT stations that you can see in the bottom left there and said that they would be bird friendly. They are not. We have quite a lot of birds that hit there. So we're working with them to try and retrofit the worst ones and make sure that the new ones will be actually bird friendly. Now in Ottawa, we also have the National Capital Commission, which oversees a bunch of the federal lands. And so they've also developed their own bird safe design guidelines, as well as an illumination plan to help deal with light pollution. And they've been working on treating some of their existing buildings, as well as making sure that new buildings are going to be bird friendly. So up at the upper right is the Gatineau Visitor Center, and then one of their office buildings in downtown Ottawa with bird-friendly glass. So in Ottawa, we're also very uniquely situated to work with the federal government. Several of our volunteers are on the Collisions Working Group, which is formed of federal employees with backgrounds from everything from biology to building management, and they're working on trying to get bird-friendly design incorporated into the government's protocols. And one of the most recent things they've done is incorporating the bird safe design into the National Master Specification, which is something that project managers use when they're starting new projects or new developments. And this is so that they're just able to select specifications to say it will be bird friendly, make it nice and easy for them, make it more likely to happen. The federal government is also retrofitting some of their existing buildings, and I'll talk a little bit more about the one at the top a bit later. So there's several universities in Ottawa, and we've been mainly working with Carleton and University of Ottawa, trying to increase student and employee involvement. I mentioned just as we were waiting to start, it is hard to get students involved, especially undergraduates, because the semester system does not line up very well with migration. And as well, there's just such a high turnover that it can be challenging, but there are some that are committed and really involved. So we're trying to get more monitoring to identify the problem buildings that are already exist and get those retrofitted. We've had some commitments there. And then some of the new buildings are also being built bird friendly, like the one at the upper right. You can't really see the dots in that picture, but the lower right shows the dots on the glass there. And then the lower left is a mural that was done by some of our volunteers who were students at University of Ottawa at a glass walkway. So that's one of our success stories there. Now, commercial buildings do tend to be one of the bigger challenges for outreach. What we've really started doing is making sure that we have lots of records of collisions that we're able to share with them and establish a relationship so they're aware of the problem and they know that there are solutions and what those solutions are. We offer things like paper bags with instructions on what to do with an injured bird. And then we've really been encouraging them to start small because sticker shock with retrofitting is a big problem. But even things like a smoking shelter, it's really great if they can start there and just sort of get things rolling. We do some youth education as well. This at the upper right there is a mural that was done by youth wildlife group at one of the Ottawa libraries, and it was designed by one of our volunteers. And we're trying to get students not just involved with collisions, but also with bird conservation and interest in birds in general. One thing that we try to do, especially with younger people, is highlight how they can get their homes treated, because young people tend to be really good at convincing their parents to do things. So that's a great way to get houses treated. So SafeWings also runs social media on multiple platforms. And social media, of course, has mixed effects on society in general, but we found that it's been very helpful for us. It's a great way to mobilize volunteers to do things like rescue a bird or transport a bird or write a letter. We can answer a lot of questions on it, but it is a lot of work, and we know that we can't reply immediately. So we have things like an auto reply for when people send us a message asking them to phone our hotline instead, because we know that it's very common that we won't get to things for hours, if not days. We also find that working with collisions, you end up with a lot of pictures of dead birds on your phone, but this is not really great material to always be posting. And so we try and mix it up a lot. And of course, everyone loves owls. So when we have them come through our rehabbers, lots of pictures of them. So let's move into where we've seen results. This is the view from that glass walkway where those Bohemian waxwings hit, and you can see that it does have dots now, so there's been progress there. In the general community, we've seen a lot of people who are now more knowledgeable about the subject and have treated either their windows at a single family home, or in the case of people who live in a strata, we've seen some examples like the one in the upper right, where concerned residents were able to get together and get their strata treated. We offer feather friendly by donation when people are coming to drop off a dead bird or a live bird. And so that's a really good time to get people to fix their windows. And it sort of just gets rid of one more roadblock in terms of saying, if you tell them, oh, go order it online, a lot of people just won't get around to it. And as I mentioned before, we've got these bags and cards and other printed material that we can give out to people so that they can spread the message. We've had some luck in the municipality of Ottawa, some retrofitting. Up in the top right is this new glass addition at a library, and the dots there are actually letters of the alphabet. So it's a word search, which is a really creative solution. We have had some mixed results in terms of, here's that glass walkway where the waxwings hit, and it's being treated now, which is great. But in the lower right is some of the other areas of City Hall, and you can see that they're also a problem that hasn't been addressed yet. However, they have made commitments to involving bird safe design in new and major renovations. As I mentioned, the universities have been fairly on board with this. This is University of Ottawa building, a STEM building, and it is bird friendly. Despite having lots of glass, it's all patterned glass, and they have committed to new buildings being bird friendly too. We do have a few examples of commercial buildings, not a huge number, but having examples is super important. This is Place Belle that underwent a major renovation of the front. And the glass in the upper right actually does have lines in it, a bit hard to see. And then they've also used things like having these wooden railings instead of glass, and then glazed or frosted glass railings elsewhere. We're seeing more and more with the bird-friendly design guidelines in Ottawa that building applications are coming in specifying that they're going to use bird-friendly glass. And this ranges from everything from mixed residential and commercial buildings like the top to the new Ottawa Civic Hospital at the bottom. One thing we've found is that we have noticed that there's architects and developers who are trying to kind of sneak things in as bird friendly that are very much not and are not a part of the guidelines. And this may be due to a lack of understanding of sort of the theory behind it. And in some cases, it's more likely that it's just that they're looking to do as little as possible. So we do have some volunteers who do review these new building applications. And if they find ones that they think are particularly bad, they forward them to another volunteer who then writes a quick comments to the city as part of the public consultation process for development. As I mentioned with City Hall, we do have mixed success stories. I feel like we're making progress, but it's not all in the right direction. For example, this is the National Gallery of Ottawa, or sorry, National Gallery of Canada in Ottawa, and they did treat this multi-story glass walkway between buildings, which is great. This is where we found most of the dead birds at this location. However, they did replace a bunch of the glass at the main building recently, and they didn't use bird-friendly glass in the replacement, which was disappointing. So I thought I would wrap up with just a few of the outreach challenges that I've personally experienced or other members of Safe Wings have experienced, and hope that this can spark a bit of a conversation after the talk about things I've run into and things that you might run into as well. Of course, the first major hurdle is money. It does take a lot of money to retrofit a building. It's not cheap. We do offer to use our data to help prioritize areas that should be retrofit first. And a lot of times there happens to be, a tree near one side of the building, and that's where most of the collisions are happening. And so it's not a matter of saying you need to treat your entire building right now, but saying start here and then maybe do a little more each year. In some cases, the worst area is also going to be by far the most expensive area. So we might, as I mentioned before, start small and suggest a smaller project like, oh, here go the lights. As I mentioned, I'm just gonna wave these, there we go. Sorry about that. So starting with some lower cost projects like a smoking shelter, just to kind of get them started. We do also compare the cost of retrofitting to other costs, and some of these big office buildings are spending hundreds of thousands a year on things like window cleaning. So when you consider that, retrofitting costs don't seem quite so bad. We also try and tie bird-friendly applications to planned renovations. So if they're replacing glass, it's not much more expensive to replace it with bird-friendly glass. A lot less expensive than just replacing all the glass just to make it bird-friendly. And then we also have been working with different contractors and suppliers and identifying which ones are maybe a bit more low cost. And these tend to be ones that don't have the same guarantees or experience, but trying to match businesses with contractors. So it's less work for them to try and identify someone who can actually do the work. People are definitely worried about their views, and that's understandable. And that's one of the reasons why examples are so important. One of our rehabbers has all the windows in her house done, and this is really important because people dropping off birds there are able to see that it doesn't really affect the view all that much. So having examples both of homes and office buildings is really important. And if you don't have too many in the town, then having lots of great pictures of existing buildings elsewhere is really helpful. And then starting with areas where the view doesn't matter is also helpful. So the building at the top there, they started with these tinted glass railing panels, which you couldn't really see through anyways, and there's no view through them anyways. So not a big concern there. Similarly, a lot of office buildings, may have a view of a street and another office building, so that's less of a concern when it comes to those buildings. Unfortunately, inertia and apathy is a problem with trying to get things done. A lot of building managers are busy people who may not really care about birds and just don't want to admit that there's a problem or have an additional headache to deal with. This is where things like public pressure come in. Although when you do go public, you do have to weigh that with the fact that you may get kicked off someone's property if it's private property. And so recently, a group in Toronto did have success with this method in Toronto, the TD Towers. After a petition, lots of social media activity, lots of public pressure, they convince them to commit to retrofitting these buildings. Talking to the tenants can also be helpful. If there's different tenants, like a different company that actually owns the building, because they're going to listen more to people who work there and who are in a business relationship with them. And then peer pressure is also important. And I don't necessarily mean peer in terms of, a person, but a similar business or group. So the picture at the bottom is from UBC on Vancouver. And they've done a fantastic job of retrofitting many of their buildings. And this has actually been one of the best ways to talk to some of the other universities and suggest that they do something is by showing them that other universities are taking the initiative and they don't want to be left behind. We do run into a lot of architect reluctance. Architects really love glass. People love glass, or they think they are going to love glass until they work in a building that has a lot of glass like I do, and they realize that it's not all that great. It's often very hot or very cold, or there's a lot of glare. But anyways, you do have to overcome that. And this is where outreach with developers and architects is really important. And that's something we're trying to do more and more of. And then we also find that even in cases where they're trying to make a building bird friendly, they just may not understand how or why the guidelines are the way they are. The bottom picture is what's going to be Ottawa's new library, Main Branch Library. And one of the big selling points that the architects talked about is the fact that it's going to be this beacon of light at night. And they said that this was a good thing, whereas everyone who works with collisions were saying, no, this is not a good thing. So definitely a lack of understanding. And this can be very frustrating because it's not that they always just learn with one example and then, don't have that problem again. Because I will talk about an example shortly of a previous building that the architects who designed the top building did, and they did not learn and are trying to continue to make buildings like the one in the top there and claim that they will be bird friendly. So one thing that has been difficult to deal with is also ineffective measures. I mentioned that some of the government buildings in Ottawa, federal government buildings, have been retrofitted. And unfortunately, one of the first ones is the one at the C.D. Howe building in the bottom left. And they chose strips of clear kaleidoscape. And we told them that it would not be very effective, and it isn't. And unfortunately, it also doesn't look great because a lot of the strips have started peeling. And so other building owners may look at that and decide this is not something they want in their building. Although a building across the way did decide they wanted this, even though we also told them that it wasn't effective. And so this has been very frustrating. Similarly, at the Department of Justice, this glass walkway, they have applied window film there with dots, but if you've worked with the commercial feather friendly, you'll know that you remove the film, and unfortunately they haven't done that. And so there's a big film there with a crease in it that we think should be removed, but we haven't gotten them to do that yet. And one of the biggest examples we've had is, so this is the architects with that building that I mentioned a couple slides ago. The National Arts Centre in Ottawa did this really big renovation in the area bottom left picture shows, and they said it would be bird friendly, and they didn't follow any guidelines. And so they used patterns in the glass that are super far apart. The pattern is on the inside of the glass, so it's not visible most of the time, and they picked a low contrast color. So this building is quite bad for collisions. We had 46 in a year, including species at risk. And based on our estimates of scavenging and other reasons why we don't always find all the birds that collide, there's probably several hundred colliding there each year. And so this is bad not only because of several hundred birds dying each year there, but also because other building owners have pushed back on making their buildings bird friendly because they say, well, they spent money doing this and it doesn't work, so why should we? So this has been a really frustrating thing to deal with. So finally, I'll just mention that outreach does have its limits. there's a couple of buildings. Well, one's a single building and one's a group of buildings in Ottawa where we've been working for several years with outreach, and they have just told us straight up that they're not doing anything. And we actually reported these two groups to the provincial government and then the federal government under two different acts. And I'll share a little bit about where we're at in that. And we didn't have great luck with the provincial government. This may not be a huge surprise given our current provincial government, but they deemed that over just under 5,000 dead or injured birds was not worth investigating, let alone prosecuting, despite the fact that there is precedent-setting case in front of Ontario Provincial Court saying that building owners are responsible for birds killed by their buildings. They are investigating 2 threatened species that hit. We've had better luck with the federal government, and they are currently investigating one of these buildings and soon to be moving on to the other one. And charges are likely to be happening soon under species at risk, which we're very pleased about. But of course, we don't want to count our chickens before they're hatched. Now, those were under the Species at Risk Act, but we do hear that there may be changes to the Migratory Bird Act in the near future that would make it easier to prosecute for birds that are protected by that as opposed to species at risk. And I'll just finish off by saying this brings us back sort of to the beginning where I talked about building monitoring being one of the first things we do. And this is really the basis for a lot of our outreach. And documentation is so important because as we've been reporting these collisions with species at risk, we are depending on things like entered data or emails, that sort of thing from several years ago. And so it's really important to have this evidence. And that's what it is evidence that birds were hitting and dying and being injured by these buildings. So definitely something to consider when you make your strategy for monitoring buildings, because you have to think about what that data might get used for. So I will just say that I think collision prevention is gaining momentum, and we're making a lot of progress, even in just the past 5 years that I've been working on this. But we need more groups everywhere, and we need more people who are educated about the subject, so that we have more people available to do things like education and monitoring and advocacy, because I feel like we really are turning the tide here. I believe just yesterday, Victoria, BC, where I'm from, just passed its first bird safe design guidelines for the downtown core. So we're making lots of progress, but having more people join is so important because, you know, we're not there yet. So with that, I hope we can have a great discussion. If you're starting monitoring or you're doing some monitoring but would like to discuss some issues, I'm happy to share what we've learned and learn about what you've found.
Awesome. Good job, Willow. Thank you so much. I've got a few questions, but anybody want to chime in before me?
I think Natalie has a hand up. I can't see anyone else actually.
Yeah, go for it, Natalie.
Oh, her hand is down. Oh, something is showing up in the chat.
She's just giving you applause.
Oh, sorry, I misidentified
Yeah,
clapping hands as a hand up.
so I've got a few questions that just kind of have to do with the program that we're trying to get up and running. So a few of my first questions are mainly logistical and just kind of troubleshooting what is more or less important. My first question is, how much of an issue are wild animals or cats for you guys in Ottawa in terms of needing to get to buildings ASAP and having that consistency of monitoring, at least someone monitoring every day so that you're not underestimating? You know, obviously it's an issue everywhere, and a lot of bird safe organizations mention this, but since you're just probably the most geographically relevant group we've talked to recently, it would just be helpful to know what that issue is for you. if it's there.
So based on some scavenging studies, we estimate that we find about 5 to 15% of the birds that collide at buildings that we actually monitor. And by monitoring, I do mean like at least daily.
Yeah.
It differs a lot from area to area. For example, downtown, I mean, the crows and the gulls, they know which buildings are bad and they just hang out. And I've seen
Mm.
some of them, like I saw a sapsucker hit and a crow grabbed it before it hit the ground.
Wow.
So it's pretty crazy how fast they can be in some areas. Whereas out in Canada, we don't find that there's quite as much.
Hmm.
And then but there's also different scavengers, so there's probably bigger ones that are able to take bigger birds away out in Canada, because it's got more green space around it.
Hmm.
So it really differs a lot from place to place. And, this is something that's sort of in my book of things that I'd like to study someday if I have lots of time. But I think you're going to have differences based on sort of the substrate that they're falling on, and as well as biases between birds. Like a
Mm.
scavenger is going to be able to see a yellow warbler on pavement a lot more easily than a sparrow in chip, like
Yeah,
wood chips. So that
that's
makes a difference
fascinating.
too.
Yeah, just having that contrast from the literal bird's eye view probably makes a difference. Um, yeah, that's super helpful to know just because we've been trying to navigate uh, what we can do to avoid those instances of collision victims getting snatched up before we find them.
And something
Um,
that might be useful for you is if you're able to get your hands on some bird specimens, a published paper is definitely possible with using like frozen, or you thaw them and then place them out and then do checks at regular intervals and see what's there every time, like that.
mm,
That's a great way. Um, that would be a great honors project, I would think. And there's
yeah,
certainly groups like us and Flap that would be able to provide birds depending on the time of year.
that's a great idea to basically quantify how likely it is for them to get snatched on like a standardized uh, kind of grid. That's a great idea.
Yeah, it's something I've
Um,
wanted to do here and I just haven't had time.
yeah, well, maybe we can tag team something. That'd be great.
For sure.
Um, so going off of the like actual moment of collision, do you ever find that birds are further away from the window than you anticipate in terms of that search radius around the building? Not, sorry, not around the building, but when you're walking beside the building, are you usually able to, find the birds that it hit within the immediate vicinity, or do you find there's a lot of time consuming, like going through bushes or checking the patch of trees that's like 20 feet away from the building? Uh, just,
Yeah,
yeah, could
yeah,
you
I
speak to
tend to
that?
walk. I mean, it depends a lot on the layout of where you're monitoring. So
Yeah.
out in Canada, I would walk maybe 2 meters out from the building and occasionally would find birds further out than that, but not often. Um, there's some areas, like if you have very dense vegetation in fall, like sometimes it's just not really worth your time to try and like search through that. So there's
Hmm.
definitely sort of a time investment versus return. Um, because you're never going to find all of them. So if you're going to spend, 20 minutes trying to search through an area of bushes, is it worth doing that? Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, and then downtown, most of them do hit the sidewalks. So that gives you sort of an idea of the distance. Sometimes we find them in the street. And then certainly some birds that don't die immediately, they can move a bit, but you're probably not going to find very much more than several meters out.
Yeah. All right. That's super helpful. Thank you. Anybody else have any comments or questions? what got you into this? You mentioned, because obviously your work is more in the Arctic and focus on shorebirds and all that. How did you get so involved with Safe Wings Ottawa from a personal standpoint?
Well, working with shorebirds, a lot of the issues that affect them are these huge global scale issues like climate change and habitat loss. And, it's hard to feel like you're really having an impact on conservation sometimes with that. And so I find that working with collisions is really something where you feel like you can have tangible results. Like I've had a couple buildings where I've done outreach and they've treated some areas. And so,
Yeah,
you feel like I just saved some birds, and that's a
yeah,
really great feeling. Um, and then as well, I wanted to get more experience working with a nonprofit,
hmm,
having worked mainly with government and universities, is just getting experience working with a nonprofit organization as well.
yeah. That's great. Yeah, it's definitely something where you can see that more direct link to problem solving and finding a solution, where I can totally understand when you're dealing with these large scale climate issues up in the Arctic, it's hard to see your impact on that. So yeah, that's very understandable. Um, in terms of like what you do with specimens, I guess I'm wondering, like, do you guys coordinate with FLAP? Do you give your specimens away? Because one thing we've been trying to navigate is what to do with the specimens. Like, you just provided kind of a good example of what we could do with them with that honors thesis. And we've been talking to FLAP, but of course there's kind of the habit of like, keep it, you never know if we'll use it, and maybe we won't. So I was just wondering if you had any tips of, like, no, you'll want them, or I don't know, like if it's worth it to kind of collaborate with FLAP and have a bigger scale kind of systematic approach to it.
Yeah, so in normal non-COVID years, what we normally did was we collected all the birds that were in sort of reasonable shape,
Hmm.
not stinky, not missing major parts. And then we had the display. And then they would usually go off to various museums. Like there's a teaching collection at Carleton would get some. Basically, if people wanted birds and they had the permits that we could transfer them to, we were happy to
Yeah.
provide them. Um, a bunch have gone to the Museum of Natural History here, as well as Alberta University. No, not Alberta Museum. I don't know why
Hmm.
Alberta wants Ottawa birds, but they
Yeah.
did. So it's really a matter of just sort of reaching out and finding places that want them. And often uh, you might find that there's places that they'll want some birds, but not others. They may not want 50 pigeons, but they
Hmm.
want some of these species at risk or that sort of thing because they just don't have a lot of access to them.
Yeah.
And so it is common that they don't all go to the same place. Um, in terms of whether it's good to keep any, we've had a few taxidermied that we use for outreach. So that, we've had some more interesting ones like, a scarlet tanager and a saw-whet owl and that sort of thing, just ones that people tend to connect with a bit more. And
Hmm.
then um, we did keep this past year some of the ones from species at risk, just if that was something that would be useful for um, some of these reporting that we're doing.
Yeah.
And that's like several of the species at risk, we've given them to museums, but we've been able to basically provide a chain of evidence, sort of, where saying like, okay, this is the bird that we found is this bird with our number on it, and it became this bird at this museum. So,
Yeah.
um, yeah, I would say especially important for any species at risk to document where they end up. And then,
Um,
yeah, the last thing I guess with that is we've talked to a few people who are interested in using specimens for various scientific things. I know at UVic, when I took vertebrate anatomy, instead of using cats that were kind of raised and killed for that purposes, because that was what they used to do, we used some of the window kills from campus. So that was a great use of them, or there can be studies. I know there's a pretty big, the wildlife health unit of the federal government's at Guelph, I believe. So that they might be interested in sampling some of the birds for various diseases.
Yeah, true. Haley had a question. Obviously, this is going to be context dependent, but what is kind of how long does it take you to monitor a building? Haley mentioned that obviously it will depend on how many birds you find, the size of the building, but what's like a general amount of time you find it takes to cover a certain amount of buildings for each volunteer?
I mean, that's incredibly variable. Some of the buildings in Canada that we measure can take like 15 minutes to walk around. They're pretty big. And it's also important to realize that, like, on a bad day at some of our really bad buildings, you might find a couple birds at one place, but unless there's sort of a kinglet apocalypse, you're not usually finding more than one bird max
Yeah.
per building. So that doesn't usually take up most of the time. But yeah, it really depends on the size of the building, and in Canada, we tend to do like one sweep of all the buildings if possible, and then another sweep of the worst ones in a day. And if it's a really bad day, someone else might do some of the worst ones in the afternoon. Whereas downtown, because the scavenging is a lot more intense, we'll have people who are just kind of circling around the smaller area that we know is really bad, and doing it repeatedly, because we know that, even if there's someone half a block behind you, they may find birds that hit after you've walked by. But it also depends as well. Like if you're in an area with pretty low level of collisions and low scavenging, it might not make sense to do it every day, and certainly not multiple times a day if you're just not finding anything.
Of course. Anyone else have any comments or questions? I guess I have one last one and then I'll let you go. What's been the most surprising correlation between collisions and the general habitat or building structure that you've found so far? Could even just be anecdotal, but just something where you said to yourself, wow, didn't expect to find so many birds associated with X.
Yeah, I would say there's sort of two main ones. The first is, downtown Ottawa, a lot of developers and city staff and just public think, well, I only ever see house sparrows and pigeons downtown. It doesn't matter if a building downtown is bird friendly, but we have incredibly high diversity of species that we find in like downtown Ottawa. One of the buildings we reported is in downtown, and I think we had about 6 species at risk, including like whippoorwill, chimney swift, Canada warbler, wood thrush, what else? Eastern wood pewee. So things that you wouldn't expect to see in that area.
Yeah.
And that's because of light pollution, drawing them into an area they wouldn't normally be in. And then the other one that's been a bit weird is that there's one building out in Canada, and I don't have any idea why, but it's a mirrored. The turkey vultures love it, and they like looking at themselves in the mirrored glass. And I don't know why it's this building, because there's tons of other mirrored glass buildings around, but they actually have sort of trampled down the vegetation in front of the windows in some areas, because they walk up and down looking at themselves, and a dozen or 20 will hang out on the roof. And it's a bad building for collisions. We don't think the vultures are necessarily eating the collisions. They tend to
Oh, right.
focus
I was
on
going to
bigger
ask, do you think
things.
it's just them queuing in on the dead birds? No.
No, we don't. we think it's a good area in general for them, but we don't know why they like this particular building. And there is a nursery there, and we've had a few worried calls from them asking if the kids are in danger from these birds. So they look a little menacing, but yeah, so just sort of weird things like that you do find
Yeah,
occasionally, but that you're like, I have no idea why this is the case, but
that's so
these birds
interesting.
love this building for some reason.
I guess they're just a glamorous population of vultures. Who knows?
Yeah, but it's like, okay, why not all the other mirrored glass
Yeah,
buildings that are surrounding this one, you know? I don't know
yeah.
if it has more trees around it, but I don't know. I don't know why they've chosen this one.
Hmm. Maybe, I don't know, could there be some temperature related thing of the type of glass, of the reflectability makes it like a warmer spot to bask, or a cooler spot?
Yeah, I mean the roof of the building is flat, so they probably like that because they can hang out there.
Yeah,
Um, but it really, there's very little that differentiates it from a lot of the other buildings in that area,
yeah.
that I'm aware of. I mean, I've never been on the roof there, so I don't really know what's on there, but I don't know, maybe they're putting out carcasses on the roof, but I do doubt that.
Maybe they're nesting on the roof.
Yeah, I mean, it could be, but I don't think they're colonial nesters as far as I'm aware.
True,
So
true.
maybe that would be an interesting study, but yeah,
Yeah.
it's very strange.
Well, that's definitely a unique one. We'll see what we find this spring at Guelph. Um, well, thank you so much, Willow. Appreciate it. This is really useful. And uh, yes, Anna, we'll have it recorded and we're going to put it on our website. But yeah, thank you so much. And we'll definitely be reaching out, I'm sure, with some follow-up questions as we're getting our monitoring program up for the first time. But really appreciate you presenting. It was a great talk. And obviously with the flexibility, appreciate it again. So thank you so much. And let's give Willow one last round of applause. And yeah, thank you so much. And if we don't talk again soon, good luck prepping for the field work.
Thank you. Yeah,
Oh,
and
but that's way in
one
June. We'll
last
definitely
yeah,
talk before then.
one last thing I'll say is I think I mentioned is those little numbered sticky tags for their legs are like
Hmm.
the most important thing. So you can
Okay.
connect birds, like a number with a bird with your data. And then
Yeah.
except for with owls and hummingbirds, because their legs are so feathery for owls. And with
Hmm.
hummingbirds, they're just too small. So we end up tying thread around them and then putting a hole punch. But anyways,
Okay.
but yeah, having a way to organize and identify your specimens is really key.
Yeah, I think right now our plan is we're actually ordering or getting tags from Flap,
Oh,
um,
great. Yeah.
sent to us. But that's good to know that we might have to think of some creative alternatives for the short leggy ones that are harder to tie around. Even like swifts or swallows might be tough too.
Yeah, yeah,
So
we
that's
do
a great
little like
point.
loops of heavy thread around those and then
Mm,
tie it to the card with a hole in the card. And then yeah, with owls, with a specimen, you don't want to have like sticky stuff around their feathers on their legs. So we'll
yeah,
tie around those as well.
awesome. That's super helpful.
Just those little things you learn over
Yeah, well,
years
that's
of
the
doing
whole point
this.
of it is we haven't had that exposure yet of like, oh, we needed this, or why didn't we think of this in the moment? So this is why
Yep.
we're talking to so many people and getting all the resources we need. So thank you so much.
Yeah, it's great to hear more people getting involved.
Yeah, it hopefully we have a productive but low collision season. So
Yeah, it's funny. It's like you don't want to find dead and injured birds, but it's like, well, this is why I'm doing this. So
yeah, there's a
kind of
validation component. Yeah,
justifies why you're out
exactly.
there. So,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
yeah. All right. Well, good luck. And yeah, I'm sure if anyone has any questions, happy to answer them.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, and we'll talk to you soon.
All right. Oh,
All
and
right.
there's one last question.
Oh,
We want to pick up. Oh yeah, great. Happy that more people are putting up stickers and definitely recommend feather friendly.
yeah,
But
that's great. Amazing. Awesome.
right.
Well, thank you so much. Have a great night.
You too. Right. Bye-bye.